Thank you.
That was very, very nice. Now, can you tell us what the song was about?
So the explanation for the song is a little bit complicated, and so I never feel comfortable explaining it to the fullest. But the song is called Nemam Sasa. It was the first song that my Mbira coach taught me. And I guess I should probably introduce what the Mbira is. The instrument I was playing here, it's got this outside shell, and then a bunch of metal keys on the inside. It's called the Mbira, and there's many different types of them. This one is the one that's usually used to teach students who are getting into the instrument. There's also another one called Mbira Zawadzimu, which would translate to Mbira of the ancestors. That one
Uh,
has a lot more keys. And like many instruments, you can also get them tuned into different keys. So you could have a Mbira in the C or in G, depending on whoever made it for you. And this Mbira was made for me by someone at a marketplace that my mom went to.
uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um,
Okay. So it came from home,
yes, flew
and
all the way from Zimbabwe.
okay, so home is, oh, you didn't bring it with you. Your mom
I
said,
brought it with me when I came to here for the first time.
okay, okay. And is the Mbira the national instrument of Zimbabwe?
We don't have a national instrument, but it is native to Zimbabwe.
Okay. Okay. Um, huh, I know you grew up in Harare in the suburbs, right?
Yes.
Okay. Um, can you just walk us through what your life was like as a child in Harare?
All right. Well, I grew up in somewhere in the middle between a medium and high density suburb. And so there were lots of houses close together. The yards were very small, even though they felt very big when I was younger. We had lots of fruit trees. I had a pretty happy childhood from my perspective. I went to three different schools, actually, two different primary schools when I was younger. And one of those was a Seventh day Adventist school, and I went on to go to a Catholic school when I was in high school. But home was mostly a Shona household. That's one of the languages that I speak. And so at home, we spoke both Shona and English, a mixture of it. Most parents do that to their children when they're growing up. They'll introduce English at a very young age so you don't have to learn it at school. And so those were the two languages that I mostly spoke at home. At some point, I picked up Ndebele, which is the other language that I now speak. But besides that, life was pretty standard. I didn't play very many sports because I had pretty bad asthma. And I didn't play any instruments when I was little, not till middle of high school.
Is there a reason why you didn't play any instruments when you were younger?
Yes, so the church that my mom went to, which I inevitably also went to, didn't allow you to play any instruments because they were off the world. And so you weren't allowed to play any instruments, even if they were Western instruments. But it was even more of a taboo if you played traditional instruments like mbira, which I now play right now. And so my mother didn't let me play any instruments at home. I did try to play some when I was at school, when she didn't know about it, but at home, we didn't have any instruments.
Okay. And so, was the religion Adventist?
No, so she's Christian, and I think the church that she was a part of is mostly in Southern Africa.
Oh,
I think if you gave it like an English translation, it would be Apostolic Faith,
ah,
but the name that we use at home is Mapostori.
okay. Okay. And what was your experience like in school?
School was pretty standard. For me, it was go to school, do your homework, do your schoolwork, and then go home. I didn't do very many extracurriculars early on in life. So in primary school, it was just standard classes. Um, we did do a bit of PE, but there was really nothing outside of that. Once I got to high school and I had a little bit more freedom in terms of extracurriculars that I could do at school, I picked on tennis and rugby, which a lot of people think is not true when I tell them I played rugby. But in addition to that, I also then started exploring potentially doing traditional instruments. And the
Mhm.
first instrument that I had interest in was marimba. And then later on, I picked up mbira.
Okay.
And marimba was easier because you didn't have to take that home. You only had to play it at school. You could practice at school. They're pretty big, so you can't take them home anyway.
Mhm.
Um, the hardest part was figuring out how to find money to buy myself the mullets to actually play. And then for mbira, that one was harder because you had to practice at home and I didn't have one. And so we started a rotation between one mbira that the students had and you could take it home. And I used to play it at my friend's house instead of at my house so that my mother wouldn't know that I was playing it.
And the taboo, the taboo in playing at home, um, what what was the source of that?
So I think that because of the way the teachings were taught at the church, it was that, you know, if you played traditional instruments, you'd be associated with getting possessed with spirits and evil practices. I'll say evil in quotations because it's not evil,
Mhm.
um, but that's how my mom saw it, or at least how she portrayed it to me, that she also saw it that way, the same way that the church did. So it's not like she would hit me or anything if she found out I was playing it, but she made it pretty clear that that was not something that she wanted to see happen at home. And so as a respectful child, I didn't play it at home, but I played it at school to without her knowing. And later on, she did find out. I think little by little, I started rebelling, and eventually she was like, okay, I can't do anything about it. And so I did invite her to some of my competitions for marimba. She never came, but she would say that she had work meetings and maybe she definitely could have had work meetings, but it was just an understanding we had between the two of us that I wouldn't force her to be involved in it.
Okay. Okay. And so the instruments, the traditional instruments that you were playing represented Shoshone culture, Shona culture.
Yes, it did. So the school that I went to I'll only mention high school really because that's when I started picking them up. I
Okay.
went to a Catholic school, a Catholic high school, and it was established in 1892, a very long time ago by missionaries. And so even with that history, we know that Christianity was used to destabilize a lot of our cultural practices,
Mhm.
and people would be humiliated, ostracized for practicing all these cultural things at home. And I think that was also instilled in a lot of previous generations' mindsets that now to them it's also either unacceptable or shameful to be practicing these things, or it's just something that they don't want to be associated with anymore. And that's not everyone, but I think a large population believed that. And even if they don't believe it right now, they're still sort of hesitant to do those practices or introduce their children to in traditional instruments or even other traditional practices that we used to do in the past.
Okay. So it, as a child growing up and even in high school, you weren't really connected to your cultural roots. You were connected to the colonial roots.
That is correct. Even though it wasn't presented that way, it definitely was the case. At school, we weren't even allowed to speak in any of our languages that we spoke at home, only English. In fact, I remember a time when they would say they would fine us if we were speaking in any other languages other than English during break time, or if it was noticed in class. And so, even something as small as that, I think, was still portraying a lot of those previous colonial practices that we had. And my school didn't have any option to learn traditional dances. I'm fortunate that they even had mbira and marimba. But even with those two, our coaches were constantly struggling to get us out of different activities so we would be able to do that, because the school recognized more Western instruments and, choir and all of that. That was invested much more in than traditional instruments.
Okay. And you are a child of post-liberation birth?
Um, yes. So I was born after independence for sure. But my mother and my father were sort of in the transition.
Okay. Okay, I'm just going to ask the question. Okay. So, was there any rebelliousness in school that you noticed or took part in um, concerning the divorce from your traditional culture?
While I was in school, a little bit of it, but I don't think it was conscious. I think it was, this is what was presented to you and you took it on and you really made that your identity. I don't think they were choosing to separate themselves from our cultural practices. If anything, it might have been lack of exposure to it when they were younger, or seeing that their parents, like my parents, weren't so open to it. So I think that they weren't consciously choosing to say, I don't want to be a part of certain things that my culture does. I think they just didn't get the opportunity to be able to choose that.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, tell us about your dad.
My dad was a very free spirited person. He didn't have much of an opinion in terms of me not playing traditional instruments. I think he just wanted me to do whatever made me happy. He didn't go to the same church as my mom. In fact, for a while, he didn't go to church at all until later on, before he passed away. But he honestly, that's the best way to describe him. He was very free spirited. He loved telling different stories, singing a lot and cooking and all things that you would imagine a happy person wants to do all the time.
Okay. And in our prior conversation, you mentioned identification with your mom's side of the family. Can
Yeah.
you just speak to that a minute?
Yeah, so when I was younger, or actually just as I grew up, we always went to my mother's village and not my father's. And so how it works culturally is that you inherit, it's mostly patriarchal. So you'll get your father's last name, you'll get your father's what I would describe as totem or family animal.
Hmm.
Um, and so your village would be your father's village, and it just gets passed on like that. And so if I got married to a Zimbabwean, my children would then belong to my husband's village and have my husband's family animal. And so that's what it should have been like. But when I grew up, of course, I still identified with my father's family animal and all of those things. But I never actually visited our village because that option was never presented to me while my father was still around. Um, I knew where it was, but we never went there. And so we only used to go to my mother's village. That's where we spent most holidays with my cousins. That was lovely. That's all I knew. And so most of what we learned was my mother's culture and all the people that were there. And then I did on multiple occasions ask about my family, my dad's family, and how they came to Zimbabwe or where they grew up, but I never got a straightforward answer. And I don't know if it was that my mother only knew very limited information, or if my father wanted to be disconnected from it all. But I know that while he was still here, he didn't tell me very much of it. And only recently did I get a more direct answer that I belong to the Ndau people. And so I never really knew anything about what my culture is. And some of the different dances we do or any other practices, because really I was more connected to my mother's side.
Okay. Okay. And your dad passed away when you were younger?
Yes, I was 12.
Okay. Okay. Um, the name of the project that you launched this spring, right? Was
Yes.
Imbizo?
Yes, it's called Project Imbizo. And the word comes from Ndebele word, which means gathering, usually gatherings called by a community leader, like a chief, or just somebody who has some authority in the community that they're in. And I wanted to choose Ndebele word or anything other than Shona because I feel most of the things in our country are Shona because of later civil wars that happened. And majority, even if you knew, let's say you grew up in a Ndebele household, you also most likely know Shona because most things, if they're not in English, they're in Shona. That is changing. A lot more languages are being incorporated into schools and all kinds of industries. But I really wanted to have something that wasn't Shona, so I would include other other than mine, other cultures in my project and really represent that diversity.
Okay. And you launched your project at school, right? Can you just talk about that?
Yeah.
How that
Um,
came about?
yeah. At the time I was at Ithaca College, and when I submitted my proposal, I was in my final year of school. I knew that this project was something that I wanted to do at some point in my life. I knew it would cost a lot of money, and so I couldn't do it by myself. But like many passion projects, you have it in your mind, and this is what I want. This is the vision I have for it. But I had come to terms with the fact that it wasn't going to happen now, and that I needed to focus on my studies. But in the spring, which was the spring of my final year, I I was working as a student assistant in one of the offices on campus, and it was a student affairs office. And so we started getting a lot of emails asking about the projects for Priest Grant. So naturally, I also got curious and I looked it up, went through it, and it seemed that the way they framed it, they wanted people to work on projects in places that were struggling with civil wars or post civil wars, just community building projects. And at first, I thought maybe mine wasn't really a match for it because, I thought we don't really have um, civil wars going on right now. We have a lot of unrest, but I didn't feel like my project would be able to represent that. But I spoke more with my supervisors and my mentors, and they reassured me that my project was important. And because it was about building community, and a lot of the things that I wanted to do were a lot about civil wars that happened in the past, and colonialism, and a lot of things that happened in the past. But that really is what motivated me to go ahead and put in the project proposal. But it definitely was very last minute. It was 2 days before the due date, and I tried to do all I could. Contacted a lot of you, contacted a lot of my professors and family, and a lot of people were involved in trying to make that proposal happen. Unfortunately, I did get the grant, and then I worked over it on the summer. It's not connected at all to what I studied in school. I studied biology and I'm pre-vet. I want to go to vet school and work with wildlife, but I always knew that I wanted to work in public health, and particularly in communities that live in a lot of these protected areas. And the connection is that a lot of these communities are so rich in culture that we don't have access to tap into because there's just no way to really access that online because these places are so remote. And a lot of these practices and a lot of this knowledge is getting lost because there's no place that's accurately recording it. And you may be able to find a few places, but it's definitely not as accessible as it should be or could be.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Um, one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey. Uh, the cultures that Mbizo is contacting, are these indigenous cultures?
We had a mixture of people that we interviewed. So fortunately, we were able to go to four different provinces in Zimbabwe. We went to Masvingo, Chiredzi, and we went to Beitbridge and Bulilima in Matabeleland North. We went to Wange and Binga in Matabeleland South, and we also went to Chipinge and Manicaland. And so we were able to cover quite a few areas all around the country, and a lot of the people that we met are from cultures that were formed within Zimbabwe, but we also have communities that live on the borders. And so we're separated by these man-made borders because they were a community. A lot of these groups lived together. And then when I won't say we, but when these borders were created, a lot of these people were then separated by these borders. And so we have some of these communities that live at the border, let's say border with South Africa, where we have community members both on the South African side and the Zimbabwe side who do similar practices, but maybe they've shifted it a little bit, but are pretty much the same groups.
Okay.
And so it's hard to say this is like a South African group or this is a Zambian group because it is just a group that was separated by a border.
Okay. Kels?
Yeah, thank you for sharing everything so far. It's been really insightful. So, following up from the conversation and the question that K2 just posed, how would you define indigenous and also on our work with Proven Sustainable, we acknowledge indigenous and maroon communities, and it would be interesting to hear your perspective and way of framing those, derived from your upbringing or the contexts of Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I will start by saying I am by no means an expert, just simply an
Mhm.
individual trying to explore all these different cultures. But I would say when it comes to indigenous, I'm hesitant to say belonging to Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe really is a line that was created by another person and not the people who lived there originally. And so I would say in going back all the way to when it was just, just land and different groups everywhere, I would say the indigenous groups are really the people who lived on that land years and years ago, before colonialism, before that scramble for land in Africa. I would say the people who just lived there, even before the borders were created, even before, Rhodesia and all these other countries were named by the British. And I don't know, I'm still hesitant to say the groups that stay in Zimbabwe because really they're scattered all over in different places.
Mhm.
But if I really had to, I would say the people who lived on that land before that scramble for Africa, where different countries came and colonized. And a lot of these groups have been there for a long time and did a lot of cultural practices that they still do today, but a lot of that was lost. But these people still live there. They still, adapt to the times right now. When we were interviewing the Ndau people, they would tell us that these are our dances that we've always had. These are some of the traditional practices that we did, but a lot of them we don't do them anymore simply because they don't see the purpose of that the purpose that they used to serve doesn't serve them anymore. But they still keep a lot of these practices and usually reserved for competitions and just displays of culture. So they're not lost, but a lot of the purposes that they no longer serve anymore. And so I would say a lot of these indigenous groups, it's not spectrum. I'm struggling to find the English word for it. Uh, Adaptable, I guess you could call it that. It's not I don't think it's location bound most of the time. I think it really is that passing down either orally or really just um, keeping those practices and not necessarily attached to land, as we know a lot of people are relocated. I feel like I said a lot of things and nothing at the same time.
Oh,
But
you
I
most
really tried
certainly.
to put it in words in a way that makes sense to me.
Oh, you most certainly said a lot. And I mean, I think it's worth acknowledging, and you have done a great job pointing to this directly. The constructs of language and the naming conventions and these kind of archaic, to a certain extent, borders, right? That are have been created by imperial outsiders coming in, like that you're trying to describe and explain experiences and peoples that have predated that and don't
Mm.
necessarily, of course, align with that and have been forced to mold to that. So that is a huge challenge. And I think you're doing incredible being able to raise awareness of that challenge. And following up in alignment with that, I'm really intrigued and wondering if you can give a specific example from your project, perhaps, of one of these groups that you mentioned, right? That there's these practices, or dance was one you referenced. Um, of what is a specific purpose of one of their dances in the past, and why is that like not a purpose, right? Or how is that purpose shifted or become irrelevant now? Would be like the first question, and I'm just gonna say a follow-up question at this time. I'll let you like address it because I just think they are very integrated. And then, of course, I would love to hear that being segued to um, your belief in the purpose of preserving these practices.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the dances that we were able to observe included a lot of courtship dances. They were also a lot of dances that were used as exercise, which makes sense, right? We also still do dance as exercise today. Dances for displays of strength when it was during war times, and also different dances used for rainmaking, different dances, appeasing ancestors and thanking them for either health or any other thing that they really uh, did as communities back then and today. I think that as an example, I would give. Oh man, we learned so much that keeping these dances in my head has been really hard. But I believe one of the dances that we learned about was actually from the Ndau people. And it was a dance that they used to do during war times to connect to ancestral spirits that served as guides during the struggle against the British, when we were trying to fight for our land back. And so what happened is during this time, we used to have these spirit mediums that would then talk to the people and tell them, okay, they're coming today and you need to be prepared to fight. And then and then the community members would then ask for strength through these dances. They would have a lot of different other rituals and dances and songs that they would do at that time to ask for guidance, to ask for strength, to ask for healing. And so we have many, many different spirit guides and many, many different stories that you could ask people about. Um, one that stands out is Mbuyane Handa, who was also very instrumental as a spirit that really helped us in the liberation struggle. And so you that dance is not necessarily relevant now, right? Because we're not that is not actively happening anymore. So we don't ask her for help in the liberation struggle. But that dance is still done today to remember how we were helped by our ancestors and to remember all those people who were fighting in the liberation struggle. And so it serves really as like a gratitude dance, you could say. It still is sort of a war dance, but today it's not used for the same reasons that it was used for then, but they still do it today to remember um, that connection with the ancestors and a lot of the things that happened then.
Yeah, wow, that's really powerful. I appreciate you giving all of the examples and
Yeah.
speaking to that within context. Do you want to add anything, I guess, again, from your personal like perspective, again, of kind of the reason for, your personal reason for wanting to preserve this and particularly archive it with through a website or make it accessible to others through the
Yeah.
website and the power of that?
Um, I guess for me, this project was very important because the issue of cultural preservation is very complex and there's a lot of pieces that go into it. And in the case of Zimbabwe, I truly believe that colonialism was a major player in the loss of our traditions. And for example, again, I'll bring the Ndau again, who I belong to. They were divided during that scramble and partition during colonialism, and these boundaries gave them new identities as they were divided between Zimbabwe and Mozambique. Even today, I have family in Mozambique that I don't even know how to talk to because they speak in Portuguese mainly. They don't speak any other languages that I do. And so besides the physical barrier between these peoples, there's also then now the language barriers that are coming into it. So even though you still do a lot of the practices, there's a lot of things that were lost because of these divisions as those Tandau in Mozambique became subjects of Portugal, while we became subjects of England. That in itself made us lose a lot of who we were as a people. But I've seen through all these interviews and through all the people that we talked about, I've seen a lot of resilience in these people. They're still very passionate about preserving their culture. They're creating all of these educational opportunities for children to learn about their cultures, whether they stay there in my dad's village or if they're in urban areas like I was. And so I think that we're seeing that shift of a lot of people who want to get in touch with their roots, who want to learn about their identity the same as I have. But it's very clear that the information is still not very accessible. When I came to the US, like many people who leave the country, I could tell that a lot was missing. And when people would ask me, oh, so where are you from? And, tell me about this, I'd be like, oh my God, I don't know. I don't know anything. And so I think internally I was embarrassed that I didn't know that much about where I was from. And so that journey of trying to figure out who am I and where do I belong really led me to looking online for resources, going to YouTube to see if I can learn more dances or anything really about where I'm from. And in that search, I found that there were a lot of things, a lot of materials, like maybe the YouTube videos, they were really poor quality. There was no context to what I was watching. And so I didn't even know who was in the video, what the purpose of what I was watching was. It was almost like just looking into a fishbowl and not really knowing what you're looking at. And I wasn't really learning anything. And even from written materials, I found a lot of materials written by white Europeans, and a lot of mistakes were in there, a lot of things lost in translation, a lot of incorrect translations. And I think that's what sparked the idea in me to be the person to try and create a platform where people would be able to have access to accurate information with context, involving a lot of these local community members, because sometimes you see an outsider will come in with good intentions to want to highlight a lot of these communities, but because they don't involve the people who actually live in these communities, they lose a lot of the purpose of those cultural practices. And so that's pretty much the birth of the project. I would say it's just it resulted from my journey to try and figure out where I belong. And I've been speaking to a lot of people my age, people that I went to school with, and they also identify with, wanting to learn more, but not being able to have access to those things. And so I think it's really important for people to have that opportunity. Of course, I'm not forcing anyone to want to learn, but I believe it is important to have access to these things, especially because a lot of people are having to go to very remote places to learn about this. And as elders die with this information, where is it going to go? And so that's really why I wanted to create an open access platform like this. And, the vision is that eventually people will be able to submit their own work. I don't think it's sustainable for me to keep going into communities, and, trying to form a relationship before we go on with the project. And so eventually I'm hoping that it would be more community based and have even, people my age going into these communities and learning about their cultures and being able to share it with others on a platform like that.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And I love that, yeah, it's stemming from your personal experiences and journey.
Mhm.
Nice. I want to, well, one more question, then I can kick it back to K2
Yeah.
if he has any. As in regards to, so what I'm hearing you say, right, is that you are acknowledging the power of using a website, and you're really even taking intentional things, right, about how you're sustaining this key information and practices over time. Um, for an increase of accessibility of that information to various right audiences beyond the locations where they're taking place, and also to saying over time, as you said, like with the elders they're passing, that it's important that this information lives on.
Yes.
And you spoke to the power and the significance of that. And I think it's interesting, right? And through our project, it's framed as proven sustainable. And so this word sustainable really is something that we take a broad uh, look at. And, in the power of how resilience relates to that, you've already spoken to as well. I just want to hear a little bit more on then your perspective on sustainability and and this broad terms in which you've been using it in the framework of even getting people to contribute rather than just one person trying to do all the effort moving forward. um, and and it was even interesting earlier, or you were mentioning some of the dances, right, of that were done to bring in or in hopes of rain, and more like perhaps traditional sustainability, like from a agriculture
Yeah.
practices way. So I'm just gonna like throw that out there, the word sustainability, and how you're perceiving that. Or even if there are other kind of words in your native tongue that speak to that even more accurately from you.
Yeah. I really wish that the other on-site researchers were able to come into this call, because the way they are able to describe a lot of what they saw is amazing because they were there in person. But they managed to capture this picture when they were in Mashingo and Chipinge, where there were a lot of teenagers dancing. I don't remember which dance they were doing, but right in the corner of the video, you can see this little kid who's barely 3 also trying to imitate the dances that they were doing in the background. And as soon as I saw that, my heart was filled with joy, because that was a visual representation of what I'm also trying to bring with this project, that these traditions can still be passed on to the children, that are being born today, people even younger than me, that they're able to then teach people later. Because yes, you can have all this information online, right? But if people still don't feel that there is importance in upholding a lot of these cultural practices, then it's not sustainable, as you said before. Um, And so to me, these things being sustainable is, having access to being able to learn about a lot of these cultural practices and being able to learn directly from a lot of these elders. And that may not be available all the time. I think it's a privilege to have somebody you can learn from like that. I didn't grow up with any grandparents, and so I didn't have that opportunity to be like, "Hey, what was it like when you were growing up?" And so I guess to me, with sustainability and this project, I really just want these communities to have that opportunity to be able to teach to younger generations what they were taught, and for that cycle to continue, because even with urbanization and not being able to find jobs, a lot of people move out of these communities to go to the capital city, and they're not able to uphold these practices. But if we made them more accessible, they wouldn't have to be limited to just one location geographically, because you can carry your cultural practices with you regardless of where you are in the country or the world.
Yeah, definitely. And do you see like some of these practices, again, even just from a stance of respect of other peoples or the places and environments in which you're in, how you see like the value of those even in direct comparison to more colonial Western kind of ways? Um, do you, like, could you speak to that at all?
I think that cultures exist for a reason. I think they exist to connect us to the land that we're on, to the animals around us, to each other. And a lot of the practices that these communities still have teach us respect for nature, teach us, Ubuntu, which is, a word that means we are because of those who were there before us, because of those who are around us. And I think that theory of oneness really is central to a lot of these cultures. And when we're starting to learn about all these different Western practices, and we start divorcing from all cultures, we lose that identity and we lose ourselves in the process, and we end up with a lot of people who just lose that community aspect of things, end up with an idea of individualism and no support within their communities either. Um, and so I think as people divorce more from their cultures, life gets harder, because a lot of these things, I'll give for example, one of the practices, my mom told me the name and I've already forgotten it, but people would go around the fire and not necessarily talk about their troubles all the time, but that served as community therapy. And so people wouldn't stay by themselves at home and just think about their troubles and, dwell in that sadness, but they had the community members to lean on. They knew they weren't alone. And so having that all the time meant people, had that emotional outlet and had people around them supporting them. And today we find a lot of people who don't have that community support and struggle a lot with depression and anxiety and a lot of these things that we're seeing today. Um, and of course, a lot of them are just clinical manifestations. But I think if we had that strong sense of community and still held on to a lot of these cultural practices, we would see people a lot happier. I really wish you would be able to go into these communities, because I just feel like if I went there, I would be a much happier person. They just feel it's a whole different feeling when you're there, because you can tell that they're just much happier doing a lot of the things that we used to do. Um, and so I definitely think that there is importance in being able to uphold your cultural practices and be connected to it. And I understand that it's a very big privilege to be able to say where you come from, um, as opposed to, living in a constant state of wonder and longing for a chance for that knowledge to be revealed. But if there is a way to be connected, I think that way should be shown to people.
You are clearly the right person to carry this work forward. Your understanding and ability to articulate what the issue is, and the issue, from my perspective, the issue is identity restoration and cultural um, refiring, cultural resilience.
Mhm.
And you spoke to the word resilience. Um, in your work, you haven't been into the communities. You've sent your um, peers into the community, correct?
Yes.
Are you planning to go into any of the communities?
Yes, that is the end goal. Unfortunately, at the moment, I'm not allowed to travel immigration wise. And so I knew that entrusting my coach and his colleague would be the best way forward because they've been in a lot of these communities and they too are doing a lot of projects related to this one. They also work a lot in education and are some of the people really pioneering this idea that you should be able to learn in a lot of the other languages in Zimbabwe that are here right now that are called border languages because not very many people speak them. Um, and yeah, it's just, wait, could you say your question again? Because I feel like I just got lost in the moment.
You didn't get lost. You did not get
Yeah,
the communities in which
yeah,
you are going to go into
yeah,
traditionally were organized from a family basis,
yes,
organized not from a nation state basis as they are today. And you spoke to the boundaries that divide peoples of the same family. And
yes.
in going into those communities, what is the message that you personally want to bring to them from your experience as someone having who has grown up in the city,
Yeah.
in the suburbs, gone away to school and come back, gone away to school to find that something was missing, found a way to rediscover what was missing, and are now going back home? What is the message that you want to carry?
I think to the people that live in these communities, it's just expressing my gratitude for the fact that they're still performing a lot of these cultural practices and trying to pass them on to the people in those communities. I can't fault them for not having the opportunity to spread it all around the country and have people learn because there are no resources for that to happen right now. And so when we were going into these communities, we made it a point to make sure that we're not, doing a different version of cultural tourism, but
Mhm.
really giving them the opportunity to show people what they want to show. We never went in there and said, this is what we want, this is what we want to show. We definitely left it up to them to tell us what they wanted other people to learn. And so just for them to know that this is not just another outsider coming in trying to make profit from their cultures, but instead another fellow Zimbabwean or just someone else from a different culture coming in, just being there to amplify their voices, not so much speak for them. And so that really is my main goal going into these communities to be able to allow them to show what they want to show and teach um, what they want to teach and teach it accurately too.
Okay. Um, Last question.
Yeah.
The the communities that you have gone into thus far, um, is there a connection between those communities that you have established?
The communities themselves.
Yes. Well, the communities, the people within the communities that you've touched on the
Uh,
cultural basis?
Yeah, I think that overall they all share an identity of being Zimbabwean. But you see that like for some of the communities in within one location, we covered two different cultures. And so you can tell that even between those two cultures, there are some things that they're adopting into each other's cultures. It's not coming into my head right now, but we did go into one community that is what I would call more of a Shona community that had a very Venda dance that they were doing. And so showing that two cultures can definitely exist in one place and not fight over which culture should be more dominant, but rather, you know, value the similarities between them and also separate celebrate the differences between them and be able to allow each other to showcase their different cultures and learn from each other. Because we do know that in a lot of countries, we're seeing a lot of civil wars from different groups that just something happened and now they just can't live together. But that really showed me that that doesn't always have to be the case. We have different cultures that are living in the same areas, but are able to respect each other and also learn from each other. But several others of the communities that we visited, there isn't really much connecting them because we tried to cover very different geographical locations. And so I would say the overarching connection would really be mostly belonging to the country of Zimbabwe, but not so much the cultures being identical.
Um, Thank you so very much for your time, your intelligence, your truth, and your spirit of resilience. It has really been a pleasure talking to you and getting to know you better. Uh,
Thank you. It's been a very surreal experience for sure. And I've mentioned before that through this project, I've been able to learn a lot about my own culture and been able to share that with my sisters who are much older than me and have been getting super excited seeing these videos. I've been showing them to my nieces, and a lot of them, maybe two of my nieces were born in Zimbabwe but then raised here, and a lot of them have now been born and raised here. But we still try to make sure they have access to a lot of this information, and that's probably also part of my motivation to try and make this information accessible, because I've been trying to teach them Mbira, we've been trying to teach them how to speak in Shona, showing them these videos. They were so excited. They even took one to school to show their friends so they can be like, oh, I come from Zimbabwe. This is, what some of the people from my country do. And seeing that spark in them and knowing they want to learn more has really been reassuring of what it's been really reassuring throughout the project, that I'm not just doing this for myself, but also for a lot of people who are seeking the same things.
Yeah.
what is the next step?
So the next step right now is to upload the rest of the videos. We've been having a lot of trouble getting all the information onto the website, but once that's all done, we're hoping to get a lot more funding for the project to expand it to other aspects of culture besides just dance. We also want to go to a lot more different locations and again, eventually be able to open it up to the public to submit their own works after we have examples up showing really what we want to represent in terms of the diversity of communities, but also providing accurate information and context for all of the things that we're putting up online. And so I know this is not happening, this year, but that is the hope that we have, that we'll be able to show that this work is possible and that it's important and deserves to be funded and needs to be out there.
One,
Can you say the name of the website so people will provide a link, but
Yeah,
also if they're just listening? Yeah.
Okay, so right now it is www.projectimbizo.org.
How do you spell Imbizo?
Imbizo.
In bringing this website online, you have, let me back up. You checked out proven sustainable, proven free,
Yes.
correct? Do you see a connection between the work that you're doing and what you're going to be bringing online and what we're doing with proven sustainable?
I believe so. Although we're not highlighting one community in particular, um, I do believe we're trying to, create materials for people to be able to learn a lot about these different cultures. And so I think in that there's a lot of things that we have in common, not right now with the way the website is, but in the direction that we're headed, there definitely is some sort of alignment between the two websites.
All right. Okay. I know we imposed on you to play us into this interview. Could you sing us out or play us out of this interview?
um, I can sing.
Oh,
Actually, no, I'd rather play.